The recording lasts only 7 seconds. No faces. No names. Just footsteps on gravel, a man's voice, and a sentence that was not meant to be heard. When the clip was released to the public, investigators believed it would end the case. Instead, it froze it in place for years. The town was small enough that nothing ever really disappeared. Everyone knew everyone, or at least believed they did. It was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where teenagers walked trails without telling anyone where they were going, and where crimes were something that happened somewhere else to other people. That illusion ended on a cold afternoon in early spring. 2 girls failed to come home. At first, no one panicked. Phones lose signal in the woods. Plans change. Parents waited, then they called friends, then they called other parents. By evening, the search had already begun before law enforcement officially arrived. Volunteers walked the trails with flashlights calling names into the dark, convinced they would hear laughter in response. They didn't. The bodies were found the next day, less than a mile from where the girls had been dropped off. Close enough that the searchers had walked past the area the night before without seeing anything. Close enough that it raised a question no one wanted to ask yet. How could something like this happen in a place where nothing ever happened? The crime scene was quiet. Too quiet. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle, no evidence of a chase. The location suggested movement, but not panic. Investigators would later describe it as controlled, a word that changed everything. The victims were young, teenagers, friends. Their phones were recovered. One of them had been recording. At the time, no one understood the significance of that detail. The recording was discovered during a routine review of the device. At first, it sounded like accidental background noise. Wind, footsteps, then a voice. Calm. Male. Close. The quality was poor, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was there with them. That was when the case shifted. Investigators isolated the audio, enhanced it, slowed it down, cleaned it up as much as technology allowed. What remained was a fragment, not a confession, not a threat, just an instruction, a command delivered with confidence. The public heard it weeks later. 7 seconds. That was all it took for the town to change forever. The release of the recording created a suspect without a face, a voice that everyone thought they recognized. Tips flooded in. Hundreds. Then thousands. People turned to neighbors, relatives, co-workers, anyone who sounded even remotely similar. The investigation grew wider, not narrower. The voice became a mirror. Everyone heard what they expected to hear. At the same time, investigators made their first irreversible decision. They believed the recording was the key, and because they believed that, they organized everything around it. The man in the recording became the killer in their minds. Not a possibility, a certainty. Every theory was built backward from that assumption. He was older or younger, local or passing through. Someone familiar with the area. Someone confident enough to approach 2 teenagers in daylight and not panic. What they did not consider was the most dangerous possibility of all, that the recording was not the crime. It was the distraction. The girls' final movements were reconstructed through phone data, witness statements, and timelines that looked precise on paper but dissolved under scrutiny. They arrived at the trail shortly after noon. Several people remembered seeing them. None remembered seeing anyone with them. That absence would later become more important than any sighting. By mid-afternoon, they were gone. No screams were reported. No struggle was witnessed. No one heard anything unusual. For a crime that would dominate national attention for years, it unfolded in near silence. The autopsy reports arrived quietly, without the drama the public expected. Cause of death was confirmed. Time of death estimated. Details withheld. Investigators cited respect for the families. In reality, they were protecting the narrative they were already constructing. The manner of death suggested compliance before violence. That detail alone should have expanded the suspect pool dramatically. Instead, it narrowed it. The voice in the recording became the center of gravity. Sketches were created, then revised, then replaced. Each version contradicted the last. Younger, older, clean-shaven, bearded. The public was told to focus on the voice, not the face. That instruction created chaos. Everyone knows someone who sounds like that. Years passed. The recording never changed. The theories did. Law enforcement held press conferences that said nothing new. Each one ended with the same request. Listen to the voice, look at the sketch, trust us. Behind the scenes, the investigation was struggling. The crime scene had been contaminated early by well-meaning volunteers. Physical evidence was limited. DNA existed, but not enough to build a case on its own. No fingerprints could be conclusively tied to a suspect. No clear motive emerged. The more investigators focused on the man in the recording, the more everything else faded into the background. The girls' lives became secondary to how they died. At some point, a quiet internal question began to surface among a few investigators. What if the voice was not the killer? The idea was dismissed almost immediately. It complicated things. It required admitting that the most publicized piece of evidence might be misleading. In high-profile cases, momentum matters. Changing direction is seen as weakness, so the investigation continued forward, even when the path stopped making sense. Tips slowed, leads dried up. The case remained open, but inactive in practice. The town learned how to live with absence. Memorials became permanent, trails were renamed. The crime became a story people whispered about rather than discussed openly. The recording stayed the same. 7 seconds. Over time, it stopped sounding like a clue and started sounding like a curse. Because every person who listened to it believed they understood it. And every one of them was wrong. Years later, when a new set of eyes finally reviewed the case without the weight of expectation, the first thing they noticed was not what the recording contained. It was what it didn't. There was no urgency in the voice, no panic, no improvisation. It was controlled, measured, familiar with being obeyed, and most importantly, it was brief. Too brief for a man acting alone. That realization would come too late to save the investigation from years of paralysis. But it would eventually force a question that no one had wanted to ask from the beginning. If the recording wasn't the crime, then where was the real one? The investigation entered its most dangerous phase the moment it stopped asking open questions and began searching only for answers that confirmed what investigators already believed. From the outside, the case looked active. Press conferences, tip lines, sketches, reassurances that progress was being made. Internally, however, the direction had narrowed to a single assumption: that the man captured in the recording was alone, local, and directly responsible for every stage of the crime. Once that assumption solidified, everything else became background noise. Witness statements that did not mention a suspicious man were deprioritized. Tips that conflicted with the timeline suggested by the recording were quietly archived. Behavioral inconsistencies were explained away rather than examined. The case began to move forward, not because evidence demanded it, but because momentum required it. Investigators focused on building a psychological profile based almost entirely on tone of voice. Analysts described confidence, authority, familiarity with the environment. They speculated about occupation, age, social standing. Each interpretation sounded reasonable on its own, but together they formed a portrait of someone who conveniently fit dozens of people in and around the town. That ambiguity did not slow the investigation, it accelerated public suspicion. Men altered their routines. Parents warned their children about strangers who had always been neighbors. The town began to fracture under the weight of uncertainty. Meanwhile, the physical evidence remained stubbornly quiet. The crime scene offered no clear path of entry or exit that aligned with a single individual acting alone. There were indications of movement that suggested planning rather than impulse, but that interpretation clashed with the idea of a lone, opportunistic attacker. Instead of re-examining the premise, investigators adjusted the narrative. They suggested the killer had rehearsed, that he was more sophisticated than initially believed. That explanation allowed them to preserve the central assumption while avoiding its contradictions. The victim's digital data was reviewed repeatedly, yet always through the same lens. Communications were searched for signs of luring or contact. None were found. Location data showed nothing unusual prior to arrival at the trail. These absences should have expanded the suspect pool. Instead, they reinforced the belief that the encounter was random. Random crimes are harder to solve, and that difficulty became a justification rather than a warning. Over time, the recording took on a symbolic weight that exceeded its informational value. It was played at briefings, used in training, referenced in every update. The investigation was no longer about discovering what happened. It was about honoring the significance of that fragment. Anyone who questioned its primacy was seen as undermining the case itself. Internally, dissent softened into silence. Officers who raised concerns about alternative scenarios were reassigned or ignored. The possibility of more than one perpetrator was briefly mentioned, and then dismissed as overly complex. Complexity threatens clarity, and clarity is what institutions seek when under public pressure. Years passed, and with them came technological advances that promised answers. New audio enhancement tools were applied to the recording, but they revealed nothing new. The voice did not change. The words did not change. The mystery remained intact. The lack of progress was reframed as patience. The public was told that cases like this take time. What they were not told was that the investigation had stopped evolving. It was looping. Reviewing the same material, chasing the same types of leads, waiting for a suspect to make a mistake that aligned with the existing theory. During this period, several tips stood out in retrospect, not because they were dramatic, but because they were quietly inconsistent with the accepted narrative. Reports of unfamiliar vehicles, accounts of unusual activity near access points not emphasized by the official timeline. These tips were not false, they were inconvenient. They required acknowledging that the recording might represent only a fragment of a larger event. Without a framework to integrate them, they were sidelined. The case became a lesson in how investigations can stagnate without formally closing. Officially, it remained active. Practically, it was frozen. New generations of officers inherited the file along with its assumptions. The longer those assumptions went unchallenged, the more authoritative they became. Eventually, the idea that the recording might not depict the primary offender stopped being discussed entirely. It was no longer controversial. It was unthinkable. And that was the moment the investigation truly failed. Because while everyone was listening to 7 seconds of audio, no one was asking why there were only 7 seconds to hear. And no one was asking what happened before the recording started, or after it ended. The mistake that sealed the fate of the investigation was not dramatic, and it was not hidden. It was procedural, subtle, and therefore invisible to everyone who believed the case was already understood. Long after the public assumed every possible detail had been examined, a routine internal audit flagged a collection of digital files that had never been fully analyzed. They were not classified as evidence failures or lost material. They were simply labeled incomplete. At the time of the murders, limited resources and early assumptions dictated priorities, and anything that did not directly amplify the importance of the recording was postponed for later review. Later never came. Among those files were partial metadata logs from nearby infrastructure systems, fragments of environmental audio captured unintentionally by unrelated devices, and most critically, a sequence of timestamp anomalies that did not align with the accepted timeline. Individually, none of these elements appeared significant. Together, they formed a pattern that contradicted the foundational belief that the crime unfolded as a single linear event. The metadata suggested overlapping activity windows rather than a continuous sequence. This implied coordination rather than improvisation, presence rather than chance. At one point, a technician noted that 2 separate data sources indicated movement in different directions within a span of minutes that should have been impossible for one person alone. The observation was logged and dismissed as error. The system favored simplicity. Complexity required reevaluation. Reevaluation threatened certainty. As years passed, the investigative team changed, but the framework remained intact. New analysts inherited conclusions, not questions. When one junior investigator revisited the logs years later, the concern was raised again, this time with clearer explanation. The response was measured and final. The case did not support theories involving multiple actors. That determination had already been made. The investigator was advised to focus on corroborating existing leads. This was not negligence. It was institutional inertia. The belief that revisiting the foundation would undo years of work outweighed the possibility that the foundation was flawed. Meanwhile, behavioral analysis continued to refine a profile that fit fewer and fewer people. The voice was reinterpreted as authoritative, then as calm, then as rehearsed. Each adjustment moved the suspect further from randomness and closer to a constructed archetype that existed more in theory than reality. The public was encouraged to remain vigilant, but vigilance without direction turns inward. Suspicion became ambient. The town aged around the crime. Children grew up knowing the story before they understood it. The trail became symbolic, not functional. No one spoke openly about the details anymore, only the outcome. 2 lives lost. No one held accountable. What was never publicly acknowledged was how early the investigation had abandoned uncertainty. From the moment the recording became central, the case transformed into an exercise in validation. Data that aligned with the recording was elevated. Data that complicated it was minimized. This approach created a false coherence that felt like progress but produced no resolution. When technological advancements later made it possible to reprocess older material with greater precision, the effort was limited. Resources were allocated selectively. The case was considered old, sensitive, and politically fragile. Opening it too aggressively risked revealing uncomfortable truths about past decisions. That risk was deemed unnecessary. The turning point came not from within the original jurisdiction, but from an external review initiated after a similar crime occurred elsewhere. The parallels were subtle but undeniable. Location type, victim profile, absence of forced entry, controlled movement. The new case did not include a recording, and without that distraction, investigators approached it differently. They considered multiple offenders from the outset. They prioritized logistics over psychology. They followed movement patterns rather than voices. When the 2 cases were compared side by side, the differences were overshadowed by a single shared anomaly: timing inconsistencies that suggested coordination. Suddenly, the old metadata mattered. The incomplete logs were revisited. The anomalies aligned. What had once been dismissed as error now appeared deliberate. The realization was slow and deeply unsettling. The recording that defined the original case was not the center of the crime. It was a fragment designed, intentionally or not, to draw focus away from something else. By the time this possibility was acknowledged internally, years had passed. Witness memories had faded. Data retention limits had erased potential corroboration. Opportunities had been lost permanently. The investigation had not failed because it lacked evidence. It failed because it misunderstood it. And in doing so, it allowed the truth to exist in plain sight, unrecognized, waiting for a question no one was willing to ask. The truth did not arrive as a revelation, because revelations imply resolution, and this case offered none. What emerged instead was a quiet understanding that the investigation had been built around a fragment that was never meant to carry the weight it was given. When the external review concluded, there was no public announcement, no admission of error, no dramatic shift in messaging. The findings were classified as supplemental, the language carefully chosen to avoid the word mistake. Internally, however, the damage was undeniable. The original timeline could no longer be defended. The assumption of a single offender collapsed under the combined weight of logistical analysis and reinterpreted data. Yet the system that had sustained the case for years was not designed to move backward. It could stall, it could pause, but it could not openly retract. As a result, the case entered its final state, unresolved but explained away. The recording remained public, unchanged, still presented as relevant, even as its role diminished behind closed doors. Investigators understood now that the voice did not initiate the crime and did not conclude it. It marked a transition, a handoff, a moment of control within a larger sequence. But understanding that too late carries no operational value. The individuals potentially involved were no longer traceable with certainty. Digital trails had decayed. Environmental evidence had been overwritten by time and weather. Witnesses who might have noticed something unusual had either forgotten or learned to doubt their memories after years of hearing a different story repeated with authority. The town itself adapted. Memorials stayed, conversations didn't. The case became something that existed alongside daily life rather than within it. New residents learned about it as history, not as an active wound. For the families, the absence of answers hardened into permanence. They were offered updates that contained no movement, reassurances without substance, empathy without accountability. The system did what systems do when confronted with their own limits. It stabilized. Internally, the case file grew heavier with annotations and caveats, but externally, nothing changed. The killer or killers, if they were still alive, were never publicly identified. No arrests followed, no charges were filed. The parallel case that triggered the review closed quietly under different circumstances. Its resolution sealed, its connections officially unconfirmed. This separation was intentional. Linking the cases publicly would have required acknowledging that the original investigation had been misdirected for years. That acknowledgement carried institutional risk, so the connection remained implied but unspoken. Over time, the recording lost its power to shock. It became familiar, almost abstract. People who heard it years later reacted less to what was said than to what it represented. A symbol of proximity to truth without access to it. The voice no longer sounded threatening, it sounded ordinary. That ordinariness was perhaps the most disturbing realization of all. The final internal assessment summarized the case with language that avoided blame while describing failure. It noted that early evidentiary emphasis shaped investigative focus, that alternative hypotheses were insufficiently explored, and that opportunities for correction diminished over time. It did not name individuals. It did not assign responsibility. It concluded that the case remained open pending new information. New information never came. What remained was a lesson rarely taught outside internal circles. That evidence does not mislead investigators. Belief does. The moment certainty replaces curiosity, investigations stop evolving. In this case, 7 seconds of audio became more influential than years of data. The crime did not remain unsolved because it was unknowable. It remained unsolved because it was prematurely understood. And in the end, the most accurate description of what happened was also the simplest and the hardest to accept. The truth was always there. It was heard by millions. It was analyzed endlessly, and it was never followed far enough.